Oh, hello! My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Oh, guys, wow. Okay, so I have a lot to say about this book, and we have reached the point in Project Poirot where I feel like things are gonna go downhill. Before I get into any of that, I should say if you've never watched one of these videos before, hello, welcome, glad to have you here. I don't do spoilers in these. What I do is I take you up in a synopsis to roundabouts from where we find a body, depending on how far that is into the book, and I do talk about character details. So like if you consider anything along those lines to be spoilers, you've been warned. I don't think that anything I say in these would mess with anyone's enjoyment of the book. I don't tell you how or who or where, all that good stuff. So with all that being said, let's dive into this week's topic, which is There Is a Tide / Taken at the Flood, depending on if you are in the UK or the US. So I know this book is Taken at the Flood. So Taken at the Flood takes place mostly in post-World War II Britain, and I've been complaining that there wasn't any like major World War II stuff happening, but now I think what I'm finding is that since the war is over, she is now willing to kind of talk about it, which, you know, makes some sense. So anyway, the war is a very important part of the story. So this story focuses around a family called the Clode family. There were 3 brothers in that family. Gordon, who I think is the oldest, ended up becoming very, very wealthy through business, and he was very generous with his family. So everybody in this family works. They, you know, came from like the middle class that was in trade. I think one of the brothers is a doctor and the other one is a lawyer. So business, doctor, lawyer, that kind of class. But Gordon, the rich guy in the family, has always been very, very generous with his relatives. So even though everybody was working, he also made it known like, hey, if you guys need money, like you should always feel free to come to me. So everybody kind of had that as like a safety net. And then during the war, he met a young, beautiful widow named Rosaline Underhay, and he kind of married her all of a sudden, which was very, you know, kind of unexpected to the rest of the family. And then they went back to London together after they were married, and within like 2 or 3 days, there is a bombing raid. I think this was in like 1944. There was a bombing raid, and Gordon and 3 servants in the house were killed, but Rosalind and her brother David Hunter made it out alive. So because they had just been recently married and he hadn't gotten the chance to revise his will, which, you know, everybody kind of knew would include his relatives because he'd always been very generous to them, she inherits everything. So this kind of puts a new spin on the family's financial situation. And by the time, so this book is taking place, I believe, in 1946, even though it was published in 1948. By the time we get to a year post-war, the family really is in a pretty hard financial situation, and we'll get into some of the post-war stuff as to why that is. But they are essentially starting to be a little resentful of Rosaline. Now she's not totally ungenerous to them, like she is giving some people money, but there's just been some difficulties, and they are essentially like kind of actively wanting to see if there's a way to break this will. There's also a rumor that her husband Robert Underhay, who was supposed to have died, may not be dead. So a couple of the family members actually go to Hercule Poirot, our hero, to get him to look into whether or not she is actually a widow. So that's happening. Then our protagonist is Lynn Marchmont, and she was a Wren during the war. She was gone for I think like 4 years on the front lines, and she has come back, and now she's going to be marrying Rowley Clode, who is Gordon Clode's nephew, so he's a part of this family drama. She's been engaged to him for 7 years, but now that she's back, she's very like kind of lukewarm on him, so there's a lot of discussion about that. And then the kind of precipitating murderous event is that somebody who calls himself Enoch Arden, and if you know anything about Tennyson, that should be something that you have some thoughts about. Enoch Arden comes to David Hunter and Rosaline Clode, the widow and her brother, says, hey, I happen to know whether or not Robert Underhay is or is not alive, and I could be persuaded to reveal that or to not reveal that for, you know, like 10,000 pounds. And then a few days later, he is found dead in his hotel room. And so that is sort of like the precipitating murder that sets off all of the action. So with that in mind, let's get to what my thoughts about this book are, and then into some analysis, because there's a lot to unpack here. There's like a lot of food for thought in terms of like the period, which I'm thankful to finally have. So my thoughts on this book are that I do not like it. I forgot how much I didn't like it the first time I read it, and I dislike it even more now. Now, I say that a lot of of people like this one, so I'm not necessarily in the majority here. I think that it is not clearly written, so I don't think that the revelation of the various pieces of the mystery and the explanation of how all these people are interconnected is done very well. Like, I don't think it's up to her standards. And then there's just some things in this book that, like, I just can't deal with. Namely, there's particularly a domestic violence situation in this book that really bothered me, and that is treated very flippantly, in my opinion. Some of that may have been indicative of the time, but just honestly, in terms of my personal enjoyment, I don't care. Like, I just didn't like that. There's something about the writing of this one that I feel very much like I'm being held at a distance a little bit for some reason, which is not typical of Christie's writing style. And I remember this the first time I read it as well. I felt like I was being kind of held back a little bit, and that is something I never like in books. Some people are more okay with that, but I just don't. It makes me feel like people are like pieces on a chessboard as opposed to like me being immersed in the characters. I would say the exception to that is Lynn Marchmont. I really did like her, and the moments that we had with her were my favorite parts of this book. And the mystery itself, I think, is interesting. I do think that if you know who Enoch Arden, what that illusion is, it takes away a lot of the fun of the mystery. So I don't know totally why she would use that. And yeah, I personally just don't like this one. This is literally going to be the bottom of my list. I dislike this more than I disliked the Murder on the Blue Train. This is the one I've liked the least so far. Don't worry, there will be ones I like less after this, but for now, this is at the bottom of the list for me. I did not like this one. But that being said, there are some interesting things with the period, so let's talk about that a little bit. So, this book is fascinating in terms of like a document of post-war England. So just for some historical context, and you know, I'm not an expert in this. This is just my understanding and what I know from what I've read and studied. So, you know, those of you who know better than me, you know, be kind, but know that I'm doing my best here. So, post-war England, for us in the States, it's a little hard for us to get our mindset into this because actually for both World War I, but even more so for World War II, the way we talk about that in our history is extremely triumphalistic, right? So like we came in, like swung our dick around and like took care of business. That's very much the narrative in US history for that period. And then it leads into the 1950s, which is a huge boom time, right? So like we have an enormous economic prosperity coming out of World War II in particular. That is the exact opposite for Europe. So Europe is in the pits. It takes decades to get out of it. And in England, there is like a real direness to the situation post-war. There is food rationing. There is not money to do basic things. And I think that, you know, I say that I enjoyed Lynn Marchmont the most in this book, and we'll get into some of her context here in a second. But in general, I was very moved by Christie's portrayal of sort of like Courtian life after the war in England, and I think it was very sad and very moving to me to just read about especially some of the older generation and how they like literally don't have money to repair their roof that has been bombed. Like there's an old doctor who wants to retire because he's old, but he can't afford to. There's this old military guy who's like very honorable, and like he's having to sell like his possessions to try to make ends meet, and he's like thinking about doing some illegal shit to try to like make things happen. I mean, it feels very dire and very sad. And I think she did a very nice job of conveying that. And maybe that's part of why I felt held at a distance, is just because of the situation that these people find themselves in. I don't know. I mean, I usually don't think I have a hard time connecting with people in those kinds of situations in books, but maybe that was it. I don't know. But it's just like shit is real, and she does a very nice job of like portraying that setting and making it a huge part of the story itself, right? Because like it is the war that has taken the Claude family from being like reasonably prosperous to just like in dire straits. And it also puts Rosaline in this very awkward position because she's the keeper of all this money that nobody really thinks should be entirely hers, and she has what they would need to be back on their feet, and she does provide some of it to some of them, but you know, it creates a lot of tension. And so anyway, I think that she did a very nice job of incorporating that kind of post-war milieu into the mystery in a meaningful way. So I will definitely give her that. And then for Lynn Marchmont, I think like I said, I really enjoyed her, and I think her situation is just I'm so thankful that Christie kind of captured this moment in gender history, because, so backing up to World War I in the UK, a huge piece of sort of like evolving gender roles after World War I was that it was a relatively good time to be a woman during World War I at the home front, right? So like women were getting a lot more responsibility. They were experiencing a lot more autonomy and freedom and like self-realization, basically. And the men were all off fighting what is probably the most horrific war we've experienced, or like one of the most horrific wars, just in terms of like the brutality of like this hand-to-hand trench warfare, gas, like all of that. And so they came back very traumatized, and because of their gender like set roles, they're not really supposed to be showing the emotion and the trauma that they've experienced. And so there becomes like a real almost like divide between the genders after World War I. It's a similar situation, but slightly different after World War II. So World War II, we have people like Lynn Marchmont. Lynn Marchmont is in the Wrens for like 4 years. She's on the front line. She has all this autonomy. She is like serving the war. And then she comes back and like her mom expects her to tell her where she is for curfew. Do you know what I mean? So like she's coming back to this extremely constraining gender role. And then like the women who've been on the home front, like who've been like taking care of refugees and working in factories and all this, are supposed to kind of like go back to being just like cute little housewives or whatever. And I mean, in the US, we kind of think of this as the 50s, and then you get into things like the feminine mystique and sort of like the growing unrest with that. And on both sides of the Atlantic, eventually this will kind of like ferment over into the sexual revolutions of the 60s, and this like kind of real pushback of saying like, no, like we're not gonna, things can't go back to the way they were. The world is different. Our experiences of the world are different, and things are going to change. But I think Lynn Marchmont really represents like when she was at war, all she wanted to do was come home and have the comforts of home again. But when she's there, it's not the same place. It's kind of like in The Hobbit or in The Lord of the Rings, that whole theme of like you change in war, and therefore when you get home has changed for you. And I think she does a very nice job of talking about that. And I think specifically with respect to gender roles of, okay, she's been engaged to Rowley Claude for so long, and she used to like, that's all she wanted. And then when she gets back, he's kind of boring to her now because he stayed home to like take care of the farm, which raises some questions to me. Like, was he not, I don't remember if the text supports that like maybe he wasn't able-bodied enough to fight. I don't know. But anyway, I just thought that whole dynamic was very interesting and well portrayed in this novel. And so, yeah, in terms of like things to sink our teeth into with the time period, there's tons of that in this novel. So I did enjoy those aspects. And then finally, just another side note about religion. I've mentioned before that Agatha Christie kind of like really resented organized religion in a lot of ways, based on like some of her experiences with her mom growing up. Her mom was sort of like kind of always flitting around between various sects and like almost like a faddist when it comes to religion. And I think that made Agatha Christie very cynical about religion. That being said, in general, she has very positive associations with Catholics. I think this is probably because her second husband, who she was married to at this time period, was a practicing Catholic. And in this novel, I think you see several points where Catholicism is sort of portrayed more positively than the Church of England. And in general, if you're going to have like positive associations with religion in Christie, they do tend to be around Catholics. So anyway, that's just a little side note on religion, since we're talking about religion, morality, cultural evolution, all that good stuff. So anyway, all that to say, there's a lot to like, for this project, this was a very fruitful read because there was a lot to sink our teeth into. I'm very excited that we finally are getting some Christie hot takes on World War II. And I just did not like this book. Like, I just straight up don't like it. It's not one that I enjoy from her. It's not one I would recommend. That being said, I may be in the minority here from the critical kind of analysis I was reading. It seems like most people have much less of a problem with this one than I do, but like I said, for me, for there to be a very like horrifying domestic abuse situation, and it to be then like those people get a happily ever after, like I can't with that. Like that really bothered me. And I also just didn't like the writing style and kind of how the story was unfolded. I just found it to be very kind of opaque and cold basically. So I'm putting this at the bottom of the list of the ones that I've read so far. Like I said, I am pretty sure there's some that I will put lower, but for now, congratulations, Mystery of the Blue Train. You are no longer in the doghouse. You are no longer at the bottom of the list. So I hope you enjoy that. I just realized, actually, there is one plot point in Mystery of the Blue Train that is very similar to There Is a Tide / Taken at the Flood. So that's interesting. Maybe I don't like that plot point. But anyway, I won't do any spoilers for what that is. All that to say, I didn't enjoy this one. Next week, though, we have another collection of Agatha Christie short stories. This is one that I've never read before, so I'm very excited. I haven't read it yet as of this taping, so I'm very excited to kind of sink my teeth into that and get some new short stories from her. I'm hoping that I will enjoy it more than the last 2 weeks. I'm hoping that this will be an uptick, and then we are actually finishing March with Crooked House, which is a top 5 Christie read for me. So I'm excited to have some new Christie and then some favorite Christie to sort of like break me out of this little slump. So I will see you guys back here next week for Project Poirot, or you can tune in on Tuesday for my next video. And yeah, besides that, I hope you guys are having a really great day. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!